Greetings. It is good to be with you, even virtually here this day. It is a pleasure to be able to travel and to celebrate fall break with my family. But it is also good to gather in new ways for a moment of reflection and worship together. Today we turn to the Ten Commandments. We are making our way through the life of Moses, and in many ways we have reached one of the core central moments in the book of Exodus. We're in chapter 20, where we hear God speaking to the people the Ten Commandments. And it's this great moment where God is teaching the people who they are, teaching the people who God is, and beginning to really form them as the people of God and the community of God. And so we come to the Ten Commandments, which is a both beloved and sometimes misunderstood or maybe misused aspect of our scriptures. When people ask about the Ten Commandments, when they're asked about the Ten Commandments, they often recognize that they are indeed crucial and important, both for communities of faith, for sometimes our society and our understanding of who we are and where we have been. And then there's efforts to, and sometimes in places, post them publicly or place them in public buildings, which has led to all types of controversy around our nation at various times. And yet, when we ask people about the Ten Commandments, oftentimes we recognize how important they are, and yet folks can very rarely name all 10 of the commandments. So maybe that's a challenge or an invitation for us this morning. How many of the 10 commandments can you, just off the top of your head, name? And then it's not just naming them, but what do they actually mean? So today I want to think about the 10 commandments, and I want to not dive into the specific commandments as much as think about what the Ten Commandments are and how they function in the story of Moses' life, how they function in the life of the Israelite people, but also how they apply to our lives today. And one of the ways that we can think about the Ten Commandments is sometimes we think of them as laws. Sometimes we think of them as teachings. Sometimes we think of them as descriptions for what life is and what life is meant to be. And it's really that aspect that I want to dive into today. And so I'll begin with this question of what guides us and what grounds us as people and as people of faith. What are the key things that we turn to and that we rely upon in times of struggle or doubt that we use to guide our lives and our lives of faith? And this morning, I invite you to think of the Ten Commandments as being one of those core teachings, one of those primary examples of who God is and who God invites us to be as people of faith. So we come to chapter 20, and the people are gathered at Mount Sinai, and they hear the voice of God, right? So one of the first things to notice about the Ten Commandments is that they are spoken to all of the people, right? And we get a sense that this is a transformational, a transcendent moment, right? It's overwhelming. The people are overwhelmed, sometimes described as being terrified by coming into the very presence of God and hearing the very voice of God speaking to them. But these are spoken to all the people, right? Which means I think they have broad application. This isn't just for a segment of the Israelite people. This was intended for all of them to hear and to know and to use to guide their lives. And I think the same applies for us today, that they are indeed shared broadly, and therefore all the people. Now, it's interesting as we come to the Ten Commandments here in the book of Exodus that we get from the very outset, God tells us who God is and what the Ten Commandments are or are for, right? And we hear in verse 2, God speaks all these words and says, I am the Lord your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. You shall have no other gods before me. Right? So here we have God reminding the people of who they are and who God is. God is the liberator. He's the one who has brought them out of slavery, out of oppression, who has brought them into new life, who has brought them into the wilderness, through the Red Sea. This is God who has saved the people when they cried out to them. And so it's a foundational moment because it really frames the entirety of the Ten Commandments. And I think it's important for us to grasp this because sometimes we hear the Ten Commandments used like a hammer, right? That says, here are 10 things you have to do. And if you don't do them, you are wrong and you are condemned. And yet that's not the sense I get from the Ten Commandments here. Because God begins by saying, look, I have rescued you. I have saved you. I have brought you through the Red Sea. I've brought you out of Egypt. I've brought you into a new life, right? And now I give you these guidances, these lessons, these visions of what your new life can be. And so when I come to the Ten Commandments, I think one of the things we can do is receive them as an act of grace. Right? That essentially God is saying, I've already saved you, right? I have already liberated you. I have redeemed you from oppression in Egypt, right? I have already poured out my grace upon you. And so in response to that, this is how you are invited to live, right? So we have the grace of God, and then the Ten Commandments define or begin to guide our response to that very grace. And so these aren't meant to be hammers to condemn people. Rather, they're meant to bring us further into the new life that God has already given us. So first, I think the Ten Commandments are an act of grace. Now, when we read through the Ten Commandments, we notice that the first 4 commandments lay out ways that we are called to respond to God, right? Ways that we will now interact with God. We will only worship God. We're not going to make images of God. We're not going to misuse God's name. We're going to keep the Sabbath day holy, right? And these are all describing, the first 4 describe how we are going to live in relationship with God. Now, the next 6 commandments define or describe how we are called to live with one another, how we're called to live with our neighbors, how we're called to live as a community of God, right? No murder, no adultery, don't covet, don't steal, don't give a false witness. These are all dealing with how we live and relate to one another. And so what we see here is that God has this great passion for the people, saying, I want to live in relationship with you. But also recognizing that part of being a holy people is living in relationship with your neighbors. And so God is giving us guidance in how to do both of those things, because our lives of faith incorporate both, not just a devotion to God, but also a commitment to community. Now, as we read the commandments, one of the aspects that I find particularly engaging here is the way that they lay out broad categories of action, if you will, of response to God and God's grace. Right? So we get commandments like keep the Sabbath day holy. We get commandments like do not murder, do not commit adultery. And those are not very specific, right? And so what happens is there's room that is opened up. There's an interpretive space that the Ten Commandments opens up for us as human beings. So we might ask, well, what does rest really look like? What does it mean to murder? Because we know that when armies go to battle, that there is oftentimes killing, or we know even in our Old Testament there is capital punishment. And so we ask and we struggle with these ideas of, well, what do these commandments really mean? And so it's essentially an invitation for us to engage with God and engage with our community as we seek to interpret these commandments, right? We see Jesus in the Gospels doing this same thing as he is working to define or maybe redefine what rest really looks like, what it means to do God's work, even on the Sabbath day. He is reinterpreting what is adultery and saying, let's start with what's in our hearts and our minds. It's this opportunity, and Jesus seizes it, and we can seize it to really engage in thoughtful, interpretation of what these commandments mean and how they call us into lives of holiness, a whole relationship with God and a wholeness in our relationship with our communities. But the other thing that I love about the Ten Commandments is I think they are also invitations for us to dream. They're invitations for us to envision a new reality, this reality that we have been called into and really given by God. Right, so think about where we are in the story of Moses and in the book of Exodus. Right, we've had people who have been living in captivity under the harsh and oppressive systems of Pharaoh there in Egypt. We have people who have been leading terribly unjust and oppressive lives. And we know that that can be a traumatic experience, right? And so we see this in our scripture, but we also know it in our own lives, that when we experience injustice or oppression or trauma, and especially if that is prolonged across not just our lives, but maybe even generations, that one of the first things that we lose as human beings is our creativity and our ability to imagine, right? Creativity and imagination, they are the first things to go in moments of trauma, in moments of struggle, in moments of oppression, right? So we can think about just where we've been as people over the past, 3 or 4 years, as we have gone through the collective trauma of COVID. We have at times given up creative endeavors, right? And we have given up imagining a future that is different from the realities that we are in now. And it makes sense that that would happen, right? Because we become so focused on this moment and what do I have to do to survive in this moment that we don't have a lot of time or energy or mental or spiritual bandwidth to envision the future and to really imagine what could be. And so when we get in this time and place where we are all caught up in dealing with the crisis of the moment, right? Of the urgency of the task, and sometimes it's just sheer survival that is immediately before us, it becomes really difficult to imagine a future, to envision something ahead of us. And we see this in the Israelite people as, they're crying out to God in Egypt. All they want is the end to their suffering in that moment. Right. But then as God is liberating them and they're crossing the Red Sea, they can't see any future for themselves other than being crushed by the Egyptian armies, which are bearing down upon them. Right. When they get out into the wilderness, they can't envision, first off, crossing the Red Sea, because how are you going to cross the sea? But God does something and intervenes and creates a safe, dry path through those waters for them. When we come to that moment where they're in the wilderness and they're hungry, right? They can't envision anything other than their hunger, right? There's no imagination about what God can do or who God is and what God will be for them. When they come to that moment where they're thirsty, they can't envision anything new in their lives. And so all they can see is the death, the dehydration, the starvation that seems to be pursuing them. And so in these moments of crisis, they can only see the unlikely case for their own survival. And so when we get to Mount Sinai, right, God, I think, is taking these people who know oppression, who know crisis, who know trauma. And he's saying, and God is going to speak directly to the people. And God says, here are 10 things, 10 visions, if you want to think of them in this way. Right, I think the 10 Commandments are an invitation to imagine a new existence, to imagine a new future, to imagine a new life. And they're an invitation for the people to come and participate in creating that new life with God. Right, so we might say, well, what is our future? And God says, well, I want you to imagine a reality where God always comes first. right? I want you to imagine a reality where you don't have to make an image of God because you know that God is already with you and around you. I want you to imagine a reality where everyone and everything rests and just rests in the presence of God once every week. I want you to imagine a new reality where people's words and speech are respectful toward God and toward one another. I want you to imagine a world where life of people in your community is respected. I want you to imagine a reality where there is no greed. I want you to imagine a reality where family relationships are strengthened. And I think in this sense, this is a beautiful image of what it means to be a community of faith, what it means to be a person of faith. God is saying, look at what is possible when we live together, when we work together, when we worship together. And so I think we are being given here in the Ten Commandments an image of what the holy life, the divine life, the faithful life of the community can look like. And we're invited then to enter into that life. God has saved the people, and now God is saying, now let's live into this vision together. And I think God is still saying that. God is saying, look, there's this moment of salvation where you receive grace from God. Now take that grace and respond to that gift by living in a new, creative, imaginative way. I think when we come to the Ten Commandments, they are, in a sense, saying, hey, I want or invite you to act in this way, right? You can act your way into a new way of thinking and seeing and perceiving and understanding the world. You can use your imagination as you are engaging in these practices to see what God has in store and what God desires for all of creation. And so the invitation for us is to take these Ten Commandments, to wrestle with them a little bit, to ask, well, what do they mean for us in our time and in our place? And how then do we begin to live into that? But I think to also recognize that as we uphold these Ten Commandments, right, we're not using them as a way to earn God's favor, to earn God's help. Rather, we're doing the Ten Commandments. We're seeking to live out the Ten Commandments as a response to what God has already done. God had already liberated and freed and claimed and protected and fed and brought water to the people of Israel before they ever knew about the Ten Commandments. And so it was an invitation for them to live in the response of all that God has done. And so our invitation this day, as we continue to look at the life of Moses, as we continue to make our way through the book of Exodus, is to say, how do we live in response to the grace, to the salvation, to the wholeness that God has already offered to us? How do we live in response? How do we build community? How do we engage in a deepening relationship with our God? And I think that's the power of the Ten Commandments, to say, imagine what your life, what our church, what our community, what our world could be when we live with God and with one another. And so today I invite you to go and study these Ten Commandments, to ask and maybe even converse with others to say, how would you live this out in your life? And to begin to pursue these directions for life and to imagine a new reality with God. In the name of God, amen.